By the spring of 1942, the British Eighth Army had fallen back to a position that looked, at first glance, like a sensible answer to the desert problem. The Gazala Line stretched from the Mediterranean coast near Gazala, southward across the desert toward Bir Hakeim, creating a long defensive barrier west of Tobruk. It was meant to stop Rommel before he could regain the Great Port, and before the war in North Africa turned once again toward Egypt. Yet the line was never a solid wall in the way a listener might imagine a trench system on the Western Front. It was a chain of fortified positions, minefields, and mobile reserves, and its strength depended on whether all those pieces could work together under pressure. If you would like to move beyond the podcast, you can see my available books at militaryauthor.me. And at trackpads.com, you will find magazines and galleries with hundreds of thousands of photos and videos to explore. The geography mattered from the beginning. At the northern end, the coast road and the approaches near Gazala tied the line to the Mediterranean, where movement was more restricted, and where supplies, ports, and road traffic shaped every campaign. From there, the position ran south into the open desert, where there were fewer obvious obstacles, and where an army could try to swing around a flank instead of battering through the front. Bir Hakeim, held by Free French forces, anchored the southern end of the system. But an anchor in the desert was not the same as an unbreakable barrier. It gave the defense a point of resistance, not a guarantee that the enemy could not maneuver beyond it. The British did not build the Gazala Line as one continuous trench, because the desert did not reward that kind of thinking. The distances were too great, the troops too spread out, and the battlefield too fluid for a neat, fortified front from sea to sand. Instead, the British relied on defended boxes, each designed to fight all around if necessary, surrounded by wire, mines, anti-tank guns, infantry positions, and artillery support. Between and in front of these boxes lay belts of mines intended to delay, disrupt, and channel Axis movement. In theory, the minefields would slow Rommel long enough for British armored forces to strike him while he was vulnerable. That was the key idea, and it sounded strong on a map. The boxes would hold firm, the minefields would block easy movement, and the armored brigades would move to the point of danger. If Rommel attacked directly, he would run into mines, guns, artillery, and infantry hardpoints. If he tried to go around the southern end, the defenders would have time to identify the movement and respond with their own armor. The Gazala Line was therefore not purely static and not purely mobile. It was an attempt to combine fixed defense with desert maneuver. And that combination demanded unusually clear command, fast communication, and disciplined timing. The problem was that such a system could fail in several different ways. A defended box might hold heroically, but still be bypassed, leaving its garrison isolated in the middle of a moving battle. A minefield might slow an attacker, but also confuse friendly movement if routes through it were not controlled and understood. Armored reserves might be strong on paper, but arrive too late, in the wrong place, or in separate pieces. Commanders might see the same battlefield differently, with one headquarters believing the enemy was trapped, and another unit on the ground feeling the line bending out of shape. Gazala was strong only if information moved as quickly as the tanks. This mattered because Rommel's style of war aimed directly at uncertainty. He preferred not to fight a tidy battle in which both sides knew the front and fed strength into predictable positions. His method was to create confusion, find a weak point, move quickly, and force the enemy command system to react faster than it comfortably could. In the desert, that could mean appearing behind a line that had seemed secure only hours earlier. The British defensive system at Gazala was therefore facing not just Axis tanks and anti-tank guns, but a commander who understood how to make a battlefield feel larger, less stable, and more frightening than it already was. Still, It would be unfair to describe the Gazala Line as foolish. It was a serious attempt to solve a serious operational problem. The Eighth Army needed to hold western Cyrenaica, protect Tobruk, and prevent another retreat across the desert toward Egypt. It also needed to avoid offering Rommel a simple target that could be smashed in one direct attack. The fortified boxes gave infantry formations defensible positions, while the minefields imposed friction on Axis movement. The concept recognized that tanks could not do everything alone, and that a desert army needed infantry, artillery, engineers, anti-tank defenses, reconnaissance, trucks, repair units, and air support to survive. The British also had more confidence in their equipment than they had possessed earlier in the Desert War. New American-built Grant tanks were arriving, giving British armored units a weapon that could engage many German and Italian tanks at useful range. Improved anti-tank guns, especially the 6-pounder, offered defenders better chances against armored attack than older weapons had provided. These improvements mattered, but they did not solve the deeper question of how to use the weapons together. A better gun in the wrong place still might not shape the battle, and a stronger tank formation committed piecemeal could still be consumed by a well-organized enemy defense. The boxes themselves reflected both strength and danger. Each was meant to be self-contained enough to resist attack even if the fighting moved around it. That gave the defenders staying power, especially against infantry assaults or hurried armored thrusts. But self-contained positions could also encourage a false sense of security, because the battle in the desert often took place in the spaces between strong points. If an enemy found those spaces, crossed minefields through prepared gaps or newly cleared lanes, and brought anti-tank guns forward, the boxes might remain intact while the larger line began to lose coherence. A position could still exist physically after it had lost operational meaning. The southern flank was the most dramatic example of this uncertainty. Bir Hakeim stood at the far end of the line, a lonely position with enormous symbolic and practical importance. It helped define the limit of the British defensive system and complicated any Axis attempt to sweep around the open desert flank. Yet the very openness of the desert meant that a determined armored force could try to pass beyond or around that point, accepting risk in exchange for surprise. If that happened, the line would be attacked not as a wall, but as a system. The question would become whether the defenders could pivot quickly enough to meet a threat coming from an unexpected direction. Command arrangements made that question even harder. General Neil Ritchie commanded the Eighth Army, while General Claude Auchinleck, the commander-in-chief in the Middle East, carried responsibility for the wider theater. That meant decisions about the Gazala position were shaped by both immediate battlefield concerns and larger strategic pressures. The British had to protect Egypt, hold Tobruk if possible, preserve their army, and prepare for future offensive action. Those goals did not always pull in the same direction. A commander trying to hold ground might make different choices from one trying to preserve mobile strength. And at Gazala, the difference between those priorities would become painfully important. In armored warfare, defensive plans often look clearest before the first movement begins. Arrows on a map can show mine belts, boxes, reserve positions, and likely enemy approaches with reassuring neatness. Real tank battles do not unfold that way. Dust hides movement. Wireless messages fail or arrive late. Commanders misunderstand reports. Units lose direction, and mechanical breakdowns reduce strength before the decisive moment even arrives. At Gazala, the British were trying to build a defensive system that could absorb chaos, but Rommel was preparing to create more chaos than the system could comfortably handle. The strength of the line would be tested less by its design than by its reaction time. The Gazala Line deserves attention because it shows that the history of armored warfare is not only about spectacular breakthroughs or famous tank clashes. It is also about the systems built to manage movement, protect supply routes, channel enemy armor, and coordinate different arms across an enormous battlefield. The line from Gazala to Bir Hakeim looked solid because it had mines, boxes, guns, and troops, but its real strength depended on whether those elements could act as one. In the coming battle, that weakness would be exposed step by step. Gazala was not doomed simply because Rommel attacked it, but it was vulnerable because a defensive system in the desert had to do more than stand still. It had to think, move, and respond faster than the enemy could unravel it.
You've been listening to Famous Tank Battles. These battles were never just about machines. They were about doctrine, terrain, firepower, logistics, and the hard problem of turning shock into victory. For more military history writing and books, visit militaryauthor.me. And for magazines, podcasts, and a massive archive of military photos and video, visit trackpads.com. Thanks for listening.